Today, we are beginning a journey through one of the most famous guides to success ever written. The world is a Machiavellian playground, and the rules to win have been hidden from you. You have lived life assuming everyone is good and honest, that they follow the same code of conduct as you. But that's where you'd be wrong. People will ruthlessly lie and manipulate anyone just to gain an advantage. So it's extremely important that you listen to this carefully and protect your own interests. We'll go over a set of laws that expose how the world actually functions, not as it should function, so you'll never be at a disadvantage. Before we dive into the first law, it is important to understand why this book exists. Many people think that playing power games is evil or something from the past, but the truth is that power is a game that never ends. The feeling of having no power is actually one of the most miserable things a human can experience. Because of this, everyone secretly wants more power, even if they pretend they don't. In our world today, you cannot just grab what you want by force. You have to be subtle. The sources describe our modern world as being very similar to an old royal court. In those courts, people had to act polite and civilized, but underneath the surface, they were always planning and scheming to get ahead. If you try to be perfectly honest and good all the time, you will likely be crushed by the people around you who are playing the game better than you are. This book is designed to turn you into an artist of power instead of someone who just makes mistakes. Each law we will cover includes a judgment that explains why the law works, historical stories of people who followed or broke the law, and keys to power that show you how to use it in your own life. By the end of this audiobook, you will have a handbook of wisdom gathered from 3,000 years of history. So get ready to see the world differently. It's time to stop being a bungler and start becoming a master of the game. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Anatomy of Deception. The manipulator operates in shadows, not because he lacks courage, but because darkness serves his purpose better than light. To unmask him is to understand that manipulation is not merely a series of tactics, but an entire architecture of control, built deliberately over time. The manipulator constructs a theater around you, and you must learn to see the stage machinery while the performance is still unfolding. Begin with this fundamental truth: the manipulator always needs you more than you need him. This is the central asymmetry that he works tirelessly to conceal. Whether he seeks your resources, your emotional validation, your professional connections, or simply the pleasure of control itself, his elaborate constructions exist only because you possess something he desires. The moment you recognize this dependence, you have located the first crack in his facade. The manipulator reveals himself not in grand gestures, but in subtle patterns that accumulate like sediment. Watch how he responds to the word no. The ordinary person accepts refusal as part of human exchange, adjusting their expectations and moving forward. The manipulator treats your no as a puzzle to be solved, a wall to be circumvented. He will return to the same request wearing different masks, approaching from new angles, perhaps wrapping it in urgency, guilt, or appeal to your better nature. This persistence is not passion, but strategy. He has already decided what he wants from you, and your consent is merely a technical obstacle to be overcome through patient engineering. Pay attention to how he handles information. The manipulator is always gathering intelligence while rationing his own disclosures with the precision of a wartime general. He asks questions that seem casual but are actually reconnaissance, filing away every detail you reveal about your fears, your loyalties, your past wounds, your present vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, his own history remains curiously vague, his explanations for his circumstances always externalized, his biography a carefully curated story in which he is perpetually the victim of forces beyond his control. This asymmetry of revelation is deliberate, knowledge is leverage, and he intends to be the only one holding the lever. The manipulator understands something profound about human nature. We are creatures who desperately seek coherence in our social world. We want to believe that people's words align with their actions, that their professed values match their behavior, that the persona they project reflects the person they truly are. The manipulator exploits this desire for coherence by creating cognitive dissonance and then positioning himself as the resolver of that dissonance. He will tell you that your perception is wrong, that you misunderstood, that you're being too sensitive, that your memory is faulty. This technique, which we might call the destabilization of reality, works because it is easier for most people to doubt themselves than to accept that someone they have trusted is systematically deceiving them. Watch for the speed of intimacy. The manipulator rushes emotional connection like a general who must capture territory before enemy reinforcements arrive. He shares secrets too soon, creates inside jokes too quickly, establishes pet names and private languages at an unnatural pace. This accelerated bonding serves two purposes. It creates a sense of unique connection that makes you feel special and chosen, and it establishes obligations before you have had time to evaluate whether those obligations are warranted. By the time you think to question the relationship, you are already entangled in a web of perceived mutual debts and emotional investments. The manipulator is a master of strategic vulnerability. He will reveal a wound, share a trauma, confess a fear, always calibrated to elicit your protective instincts without actually ceding any power. This manufactured vulnerability serves as both shield and weapon. It is a shield because it makes you hesitate to confront him, lest you harm someone who is already suffering. It is a weapon because it positions him as someone who needs your care, your patience, your understanding, thereby justifying his otherwise inexcusable behaviors as symptoms of his pain, rather than choices reflecting his character. Consider how he responds when you succeed. The manipulator cannot genuinely celebrate your victories because your growing power represents a threat to the control he has carefully constructed. He will praise you certainly, but the praise will always carry a subtle poison. Perhaps he will compliment your achievement while noting how lucky you were, or how much help you received, or how it's about time after all your failures. He might celebrate your success while simultaneously reminding you of his role in making it possible, thereby converting your accomplishment into his investment, your triumph into his asset. Watch carefully when you shine, for the manipulator's true nature emerges most clearly in those moments when the spotlight shifts away from him. The manipulator creates chaos as a form of control. When you begin to establish boundaries, he escalates. When you start to gain clarity, he manufactures confusion. When you attempt to extract yourself, he generates crisis. This chaos is not evidence of his loss of control, but rather the instrument of its maintenance. In the storm he creates, you become focused on managing the immediate turbulence rather than executing your strategic withdrawal. He keeps you perpetually in crisis mode, where your decisions are reactive and emotional rather than considered and rational. To gain advantage over such a person, you must first accomplish something that feels counterintuitive. You must become still. The manipulator's power depends on your movement, your reaction, your emotional responsiveness. Every time you react to his provocations, you confirm that his buttons still work, that he can still make you dance. Stillness breaks his mechanism. When you stop defending yourself against accusations, stop trying to prove your worth, stop explaining your decisions, stop rushing to reassure him, you remove the oxygen from his fire. Cultivate what might be called strategic opacity. If the manipulator's power comes from knowing you better than you know yourself, your power comes from becoming unknowable. Stop volunteering information about your plans, your resources, your relationships, your emotional state. Answer questions briefly. Reveal nothing that could be weaponized. Let your life become a book, written in a language he cannot read. This opacity frustrates the manipulator because it renders his primary tool, leverage through knowledge, useless. Document everything. The manipulator relies on the fading of memory, on the difficulty of reconstructing exactly who said what when. Keep records of conversations, save messages, note dates and times. This documentation serves not as evidence for some future tribunal, but as an anchor for your own reality. When he tells you that you're remembering wrong, you will have something solid to hold on to. When he claims he never said something you clearly remember, you will have proof. This practice of documentation is not paranoia but sanity preservation. Learn to recognize and resist the cycle of abuse and reconciliation that the manipulator orchestrates. After an incident of manipulation, boundary violation, or outright cruelty, there will come a period of warmth, apology, and apparent transformation. This is not growth but theater. The manipulator becomes the person you wished he was all along, demonstrating that he is capable of kindness, respect, and genuine connection. This intermittent reinforcement is more addictive than any drug. It makes you believe that the real him is the good version and the bad behavior is an aberration. The truth is precisely the reverse. The manipulation is his authentic self, and the kindness is the performance. Accept this bitter reality, and you free yourself from the cycle. The manipulator maintains control through isolation. He will subtly undermine your other relationships, casting doubt on your friends' motives, creating conflicts between you and your family, demanding so much of your time and energy that other connections atrophy. This isolation serves his purpose perfectly, because it removes alternative sources of perspective and support. To gain advantage, you must deliberately maintain and strengthen your connections to others, even when, especially when, the manipulator makes this difficult. These relationships are lifelines, and the manipulator knows it. Understand that the manipulator interprets kindness as weakness and boundaries as challenges. When you are accommodating, he does not feel gratitude, but rather contempt, because in his worldview, anyone who can be exploited deserves to be exploited. When you set limits, he does not respect your autonomy, but rather escalates his efforts, because boundaries represent a denial of his will, and his will is the only thing he considers legitimate. This means that attempting to manage the relationship through increased kindness or careful boundary setting is ultimately futile. You cannot train a manipulator to treat you well, because your treatment is not based on your behavior, but on his character. The path to advantage lies in the recognition that this is not a relationship to be fixed, but a trap to be escaped. The manipulator will never voluntarily release you because you serve a function in his psychological economy. Your liberation must be unilateral, decided and executed without his permission or participation. This requires you to overcome perhaps the deepest form of his manipulation, the belief that you owe him something, that you are responsible for his well-being, that leaving would make you the villain in the story. The truth is simpler and harder. You owe nothing to someone who has systematically undermined your reality, exploited your vulnerabilities, and treated your autonomy as an obstacle to be overcome. The advantage you seek is not victory within the relationship, but freedom from it entirely. And that freedom begins the moment you recognize that the theater he has built around you has one feature he has never been able to control. The exit is always there, and only you can walk through it. Chapter 2. Pose as a friend. Work as a spy. The first and most effective rule for unmasking a manipulator is to pose as a friend, work as a spy. This law teaches you that the only way to truly see through a liar is to gather information without them knowing you are doing it. To gain an advantage, you must become a master psychologist who can see past the cloud of dust that people use to hide their real plans. Instead of asking someone if they are lying, which only makes them more careful, you should use what the sources call artful spying in everyday conversations. You do this by asking indirect questions that trick the person into revealing their weaknesses or their true goals. You can also use a clever trick called fake sincerity, where you tell a secret about yourself that you actually made up. When you do this, the other person feels they can trust you and will often tell you a real secret about themselves, giving you the upper hand. The sources say this is a very smart way to draw out the confidence and secrets of the other. To beat a manipulator at their own game, you have to stay one step ahead by testing them. You can follow the example of King Chosroes II, who once told a courtier a secret, just to see if that person would tell someone else. If the courtier's behavior changed, the king knew he was being betrayed and could act before any damage was done. Another way to gain an advantage is to use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim. Liars often use one sincere and honest move to cover up dozens of dishonest ones. If someone is suddenly being very nice or giving you a Trojan horse gift, you should be on high alert because they are likely trying to open a hole in your armor so they can manipulate you. Every manipulator has a weakness, which the sources call a thumbscrew or a gap in the castle wall. This weakness is often a secret need, an uncontrollable emotion, or a fear. To find it, you should look for the helpless child inside them, a need they didn't get as a kid, like attention or validation. Once you find what they truly crave, you can turn it to your advantage and make them move in whichever direction you. Finally, if you want to completely shut down a manipulator, you can use disarm and infuriate with the mirror effect. By doing exactly what they do, Mirroring their actions and their style, you make it impossible for them to figure out what you are thinking. This mocks and humiliates them, often making them get angry and overreact. When they lose their cool, their mask falls off, and you can see their real strategy clearly. Chapter 3. Building your fortress. And now that you have learned to see the manipulator clearly, you must understand a more dangerous truth. Recognition alone does not protect you. The manipulator does not retreat simply because you have discovered his methods. In fact, your awareness often provokes escalation, for the manipulator senses when his control is slipping and responds with greater intensity, like a predator that quickens its pace when it realizes the prey has noticed its approach. The second phase of your education concerns not merely seeing the trap but systematically dismantling it while constructing fortifications that render you immune to future manipulation. The foundation of your defense must be erected in the territory of your own mind, for this is where the manipulator has done his deepest work. He has planted seeds there, ideas that feel like your own thoughts, but are actually his voice ventriloquized through your internal dialogue. You believe you are too sensitive, that you expect too much, that you have a pattern of ruining good relationships, that no one else would tolerate your flaws the way he does. These thoughts arrive with such familiarity that you assume they originated within you, but they are actually the residue of countless small suggestions, carefully deployed criticisms, strategic comparisons to others who are more easygoing or less demanding. The first construction project in your fortress is the purification of your internal voice, learning to distinguish between genuine self-reflection and implanted doubt. This purification requires a practice that the ancients understood, but that modern sentiment often dismisses: ruthless interrogation of your own thoughts. When you catch yourself thinking that you are overreacting, pause and ask where that assessment comes from. Can you point to objective evidence, or are you simply repeating what the manipulator has told you about yourself? When you feel guilty for asserting a need, trace the origin of that guilt. Is it arising from a genuine moral failing on your part, or has guilt been weaponized so effectively that it now triggers automatically whenever you prioritize yourself? This interrogation is not comfortable, but comfort is not the objective. Clarity is the objective, and clarity often requires you to demolish structures you have long mistaken for load-bearing walls of your personality. The manipulator has trained you to manage his emotions, and this training must be reversed. You have become so attuned to his moods, so skilled at reading the subtle signs of his displeasure, so quick to adjust your behavior to prevent his storms, that you have essentially outsourced your decision-making to his emotional weather patterns. You do not ask yourself what you want or need, but rather what will keep the peace, what will avoid conflict, what will maintain his approval. This is precisely the cage he has built. Your escape requires the deliberate practice of allowing his emotions to be his own problem. When he sulks because you have made plans that do not include him, you must resist the trained impulse to cancel your plans or to spend your time managing his feelings about your autonomy. When he manufactures hurt over a boundary you have set, you must practice the cold discipline of letting that manufactured hurt exist without rushing to soothe it. This practice feels at first like cruelty. The manipulator has cultivated in you such sensitivity to his pain that allowing him to experience discomfort without intervention feels like a moral failure. But consider the deeper architecture at work here. By making you responsible for his emotional stability, he has created a system in which your freedom always generates his suffering, thereby making your freedom feel like an act of violence against him. This is perhaps the most elegant trap the manipulator sets, for it turns your compassion into chains. The counter to this trap is the recognition that genuine suffering and performed suffering are not the same thing, and that you are not responsible for the emotions that another person chooses to weaponize against you. You must become a student of your own patterns, particularly the patterns that the manipulator exploits. Every person carries vulnerabilities shaped by their history, and the skilled manipulator identifies these vulnerabilities with the precision of a locksmith identifying the pins in a lock. Perhaps you have a deep fear of abandonment, and the manipulator has learned that threatening withdrawal is the quickest way to bring you to heel. Perhaps you have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, and the manipulator frames his needs as crises that only you can solve. Perhaps you are driven by a hunger for approval that stems from childhood neglect, and the manipulator rations praise with the calculation of a drug dealer who knows that scarcity increases value. Whatever your particular vulnerability, the manipulator has mapped it and built his strategy around it. The fortress you are building must have walls specifically designed to defend against your known weaknesses. This means you must do something that feels counterintuitive. You must deliberately expose yourself to the discomfort of your unfulfilled needs in controlled circumstances. If you fear abandonment, you must practice being alone and discovering that aloneness is not death. If you crave approval, you must make decisions that you know will meet with disapproval and learn to survive the absence of validation. If you feel compulsively responsible for others, you must practice the discipline of allowing problems that are not yours to remain unsolved. This is exposure therapy applied to psychological manipulation. You are desensitizing yourself to the very pressures that the manipulator uses to control you. The manipulator relies heavily on your isolation, but he has taught you to think of this isolation as your own choice, your own preference, even your own failing. He has suggested that your friends do not really understand you, that your family is toxic, that other people are judgmental or unsupportive. In reality, he has been systematically cutting the threads that connect you to alternative sources of perspective and support, because these connections pose the greatest threat to his control. People who know you well and care about your well-being can see things you cannot see when you are inside the fog of manipulation. They ask questions that you have stopped asking yourself. They remind you of who you were before this relationship reshaped you. The manipulator understands that your connections to others are competing power centers, and so he works to dismantle them through a patient campaign of suggestion and manufactured conflict. Your counter-strategy must involve the deliberate reconstruction and fortification of your social connections. This is more difficult than it sounds, because the manipulator has likely succeeded in damaging some of these relationships, and because you have been trained to filter all social interaction through the lens of his approval. Reaching out to old friends feels like betrayal. Sharing your reality with family feels like disloyalty. Seeking support feels like weakness. These feelings are not organic but installed, and you must act against them with the same determination that a physical therapist pushes a patient to move an injured limb. The movement hurts, but the hurt is the path to healing. When you reconnect with others, you may discover something disturbing. The manipulator's version of reality has colonized your speech. You find yourself defending him, explaining away his behavior, minimizing incidents that others recognize as serious violations. This is not dishonesty, but rather evidence of how thoroughly the manipulator's perspective has infiltrated your own thinking. The antidote is the simple practice of reporting facts without interpretation. Do not explain why he did something. Do not provide context that reframes cruelty as misunderstanding. Do not soften the blow. Simply describe what happened. He went through my phone without permission. He told me I was stupid for feeling hurt. He threatened to leave when I asked him to stop criticizing me. Facts have a clarifying power that interpretation dilutes, and you will be surprised how differently others react to the facts alone compared to the facts wrapped in the manipulator's narrative frame. The manipulator maintains his position through what might be called the weaponization of hope. He ensures that you are never quite comfortable enough to stay, nor quite miserable enough to leave. There are always just enough good moments, just enough promises of change, just enough glimpses of the person you wish he was, to keep you believing that the next month, the next year, after this stressful period passes, when he has dealt with his current challenges, things will finally become what you have been waiting for them to become. This hope is not evidence of the relationship's potential, but rather the mechanism of your imprisonment. The manipulator understands that as long as you are oriented toward a future version of the relationship, you will tolerate the present version indefinitely. To build your fortress, you must perform a brutal calculation that most people avoid because it feels unromantic and mercenary. You must evaluate the relationship not based on its promised future or its remembered past, but on its actual present. If this is as good as it gets, if nothing ever changes from this moment forward, is this a life you want to live? Not a life you could survive, not a life that has its occasional good moments, but a life that genuinely nourishes and expands you. The manipulator has trained you to grade on a curve so generous that simply not being actively cruel counts as kindness. that the absence of manipulation counts as love, that periodic returns to baseline decency count as dramatic improvement. You must recalibrate your standards by asking what you would counsel a person you deeply love to accept, because what you would not want for someone you love, you should not accept for yourself. The manipulator's power is sustained by what we might call the presumption of good intent. You have been operating under the assumption that his behavior, however harmful, stems from wounds or ignorance, rather than from choice and character. You tell yourself that if he truly understood how much his actions hurt you, he would change. You believe that your job is to find the right words, the right tone, the right timing to finally make him see. This presumption is the manipulator's greatest ally because it keeps you focused on the impossible project of teaching empathy to someone who finds your pain useful. The fortress you are building must include the acceptance of a hard truth. The manipulator understands exactly what he is doing, and he continues to do it because it serves his purposes. His behavior is not a communication problem, but a character revelation. Once you accept that you are dealing not with misunderstanding, but with choice, your strategy must shift entirely. You are no longer trying to educate or reform. You are simply protecting yourself from someone whose interests are fundamentally opposed to your own. This shift in framing is psychologically difficult because it requires you to abandon the role of helper, teacher, or healer, roles that may be central to your identity. But these roles, noble as they are in appropriate contexts, have been exploited. The manipulator has transformed your desire to help into a mechanism of control by presenting himself as perpetually in need of your patience, your understanding, your forgiveness, your second chances. Your fortress must include the recognition that some people do not want help but rather supply, and you must refuse to be supply any longer. The architecture of your defense must also include what strategists call defense in depth. You cannot rely on a single boundary or a single defensive measure, because the manipulator is relentless and adaptive. When one approach fails, he will try another. When direct pressure does not work, he will use indirect pressure through mutual friends or family. When anger does not move you, he will try tears. When threats do not work, he will try promises. Your defense must be layered, redundant, and internally reinforced so that the failure of one defensive line does not result in total collapse. This means having multiple sources of support, multiple exit strategies, multiple ways of maintaining your reality when it is under assault. You must also prepare yourself for the siege mentality that the manipulator will adopt when he realizes that his usual tactics are no longer effective. He will increase the frequency and intensity of his attempts at control. He will manufacture crises designed to prove that you need him. He will oscillate rapidly between charm and rage, love and contempt, promises and threats, attempting to keep you off balance and unable to maintain your resolve. This escalation is actually evidence that your defenses are working, though it will feel like evidence of catastrophe. The manipulator escalates because his control is slipping, and he is attempting to re-establish dominance through overwhelming force. Your fortress must be built strong enough to weather this storm without opening the gates. The final element of your fortress, and perhaps the most important, is the construction of an exit that exists independent of his cooperation or approval. The manipulator has likely entangled your life with his in ways that make departure seem impossibly complicated. Perhaps finances are intertwined, or living situations are shared, or social circles overlap completely, or children are involved, or professional relationships are at stake. These entanglements are not accidents, but engineering. Each thread that binds your life to his is another barrier to your freedom, and the manipulator has been weaving these threads with the patience of a spider building a web. Your counter-strategy must involve the systematic disentanglement of your life from his, done quietly and methodically while his attention is focused elsewhere. This is not dishonesty, but wisdom. You do not announce to a captor that you are planning escape. You simply prepare the means of escape and then use them when the moment is right. The fortress you are building is not ultimately about walls, but about sovereignty. You are reclaiming the right to govern your own reality, to define your own worth, to pursue your own interests, to maintain your own boundaries, to trust your own perceptions. The manipulator has functioned as an occupying force in the territory of your selfhood, and you are mounting a campaign of liberation. This campaign requires strategy, patience, discipline, and above all, the acceptance that the manipulator will never voluntarily cede the ground he has taken. Your freedom must be seized, not negotiated. And that seizure begins with the fortifications you build in your own mind, where his voice no longer echoes and your own authority is absolute. Chapter 4. Turn the manipulator's weapons against him. You have learned to see the manipulator clearly, and you have fortified yourself against his assaults. Now comes the most delicate and dangerous phase of your education, the active use of the manipulator's own methods to destabilize his control and establish your dominance in the relationship's final act. This is not about becoming a manipulator yourself, for that would mean adopting the very corruption you seek to escape. Rather, this is about understanding that the manipulator's techniques derive their power from asymmetry, from the fact that he operates with strategic consciousness while you operate with naive authenticity. When you bring strategic consciousness to bear on the interaction while maintaining your moral core, you do not become him. You simply stop being his victim. The manipulator's first and most fundamental technique is the control of frame, which is to say the control of how reality itself is interpreted and understood within the relationship. He has established himself as the authority on what things mean, what is reasonable, what is acceptable, what is normal. When you express hurt, he determines whether that hurt is legitimate or whether you are being oversensitive. When you describe his behavior, he determines whether your description is accurate or whether you are distorting reality. When you set a boundary, he determines whether that boundary is reasonable or whether you are being controlling. This power to determine meaning is the heart of his control, and it must be seized from him if you are to gain any advantage. The reversal begins with a simple but profound act. You stop seeking his validation of your reality. When he tells you that you are remembering an event incorrectly, you do not argue or attempt to convince him. You simply maintain your version of events with the same unshakable certainty that he maintains his. When he tells you that your feelings are disproportionate, you do not defend the legitimacy of your feelings. You simply continue to honor them as valid, regardless of his assessment. This shift is more powerful than it appears, because the manipulator's entire system depends on your acceptance of his authority as the arbiter of truth. When you withdraw that acceptance without announcement or drama, simply through the quiet insistence on your own perceptions, you have pulled a foundational stone from his edifice. The manipulator uses uncertainty as a weapon, keeping you perpetually off balance about where you stand, whether he is pleased or displeased, whether the relationship is secure or in jeopardy. This uncertainty keeps you focused on him, on reading his signals, on adjusting your behavior to maintain his approval or avoid his displeasure. The countermove is to become unpredictable yourself, not through erratic behavior, but through the withdrawal of the patterns he has learned to exploit. If he is accustomed to you immediately answering his calls, you begin to let some calls go to voicemail and return them on your own schedule. If he expects you to rearrange your plans when he expresses desire for your company, you begin to maintain your plans regardless of his preferences. If he has learned that expressing hurt or anger will bring you rushing to appease him, you begin to allow his emotional weather to occur without your intervention. This unpredictability must be deployed with careful attention to your actual goals. You are not trying to punish him or teach him a lesson, though he will certainly interpret your behavior as punishment, because he cannot conceive of actions that are not oriented toward controlling others. You are simply reclaiming your autonomy, acting according to your own needs and preferences, rather than in constant reaction to his. The manipulator has trained you to be exquisitely responsive to him, and you are becoming selectively unresponsive. This selective unresponsiveness creates a crisis in his system because he can no longer reliably predict how you will react, which means he can no longer reliably control you. Consider how the manipulator uses information, always gathering data about you while revealing little about himself. You must reverse this flow. Begin to treat your inner life, your plans, your thoughts, your feelings as classified information that he has not earned access to. When he asks intrusive questions, answer vaguely or deflect entirely. When he attempts to extract information about your schedule, your finances, your other relationships, provide only what is strictly necessary and nothing more. At the same time, begin to ask him direct questions about matters he has kept deliberately vague. Where exactly does his money come from? What specifically happened in his previous relationships? What are the concrete details of the various crises and dramas that seem to perpetually surround him? You are not seeking these answers because you believe he will tell you the truth, but because the questions themselves shift the dynamic, putting him in the unfamiliar position of being the one whose reality is being interrogated. The manipulator relies heavily on your emotional reactivity. He says something cruel or provocative, and your immediate hurt or anger provides him with both entertainment and leverage. Your reaction confirms that he still has power over you, that he can still make you feel things, that your emotional state is still responsive to his inputs. The most effective counter to this is the cultivation of what might be called strategic blandness. When he makes a provocative statement, you respond with minimal affect. Interesting perspective. I see. If you say so. These non-responses deprive him of the emotional supply he is seeking. They also protect you from being drawn into arguments that the manipulator does not want to win, but rather wants to use as opportunities to wound you, confuse you, or extract information about your vulnerabilities. This strategic blandness extends to your presentation of your own emotional state. The manipulator has learned to read you with uncomfortable accuracy, identifying signs of weakness, uncertainty, or need that he can then exploit. You must become opaque to him. When you are hurting, you do not show it in his presence. When you are uncertain, you project confidence. When you need something, you do not reveal that need. This is not about dishonesty, but about refusing to continue providing your opponent with intelligence about your vulnerabilities. In warfare, one does not provide the enemy with maps of one's defenses. In this psychological warfare, you do not provide the manipulator with maps of your emotional interior. The manipulator frequently employs what might be called the manufacture of obligation. He does you unsolicited favors, provides help you did not request, gives gifts that serve his agenda more than your needs, all while maintaining a careful accounting of these supposed kindnesses. Later, when you attempt to assert boundaries or refuse his demands, he produces this ledger of debt, suggesting that you owe him compliance in exchange for his generosity. The counter to this is the ruthless refusal of his gifts and assistance. When he offers help, you decline. When he insists on doing something for you, you firmly refuse. When he gives you gifts, you thank him politely and then donate them, sell them, or otherwise remove them from your life. This refusal accomplishes two things. It prevents the accumulation of manufactured debt, and it signals that you are no longer participating in the transaction he has been conducting. There is a particular moment in the trajectory of manipulation when the manipulator senses that he is losing control and attempts to re-establish dominance through what we might call the nuclear option. He threatens ultimate withdrawal, final abandonment, the permanent end of the relationship. This is meant to trigger your deepest fears and bring you back into compliance through sheer terror of loss. The reversal of this weapon is perhaps the most powerful move available to you. You call his bluff. When he threatens to leave, you facilitate his departure. When he suggests that this might be over, you agree that perhaps it should be. When he paints a picture of what you will lose without him, you express your willingness to accept that loss. This move works because the manipulator's threats are almost always hollow. He does not actually want to leave, because you are serving important functions for him. When you call his bluff, one of two things happens, and both are victories for you. Either he actually leaves, in which case you have achieved liberation from someone who was systematically harming you, or he retreats from his threat, and you have demonstrated that his ultimate weapon has no power over you. The manipulator may attempt this threat and retreat cycle multiple times, and each time you must maintain the same position. His presence in your life is not so valuable that you will sacrifice your dignity and autonomy to maintain it. This is not a game of chicken where you hope he will swerve. This is a genuine willingness to let the relationship end. A willingness born from the recognition that the relationship as it currently exists is already a kind of death, just a slower and more painful one. The manipulator often positions himself as the expert on you, claiming to understand you better than you understand yourself. He tells you what you really mean when you say things, what you really want when you express preferences. what you really feel beneath what you claim to feel. This presumption of superior knowledge about your own interior experience is extraordinarily invasive. But it works because part of you believes he might be right, that he might see something about you that you are missing. The reversal here is to explicitly reject his authority on your own experience. When he tells you what you really mean, you correct him flatly. No, I mean exactly what I said. When he interprets your feelings for you, you contradict him without elaboration. You're wrong about what I feel. You do not explain or justify or attempt to make him understand. You simply assert your own authority on your own experience and refuse to grant him any legitimacy in that domain. There is a technique the manipulator uses that might be called the strategic interpretation of your strengths as weaknesses. When you are thoughtful, he frames it as overthinking. When you are caring, he frames it as codependency. When you are principled, he frames it as rigidity. When you are forgiving, he frames it as being a pushover. This reframing serves to undermine your confidence in your own positive qualities and to make you doubt whether your virtues are actually flaws. The counter is to explicitly reframe his weaknesses as the pathologies they actually are. When he is demanding, you name it as entitlement. When he is volatile, you name it as instability. When he is secretive, you name it as dishonesty. When he is dismissive of your feelings, you name it as cruelty. You are not doing this to hurt him, but to maintain clarity about what you are actually dealing with. The manipulator has almost certainly isolated you from other perspectives, but he has done this while maintaining his own network of supporters, allies, and alternative sources of validation. He can afford to be cavalier about whether you approve of him because he has other people providing him with affirmation. Meanwhile, he has worked to ensure that you are dependent primarily on him for validation and support. The reversal requires you to rebuild your network while simultaneously becoming indifferent to his. You stop caring whether his friends like you, whether his family approves of you, whether he speaks well of you to others. At the same time, you cultivate relationships where you are genuinely valued and where your reality is confirmed rather than denied. This shift in the balance of social power changes everything, because it means his approval or disapproval no longer has the weight it once carried. Consider the manipulator's use of intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable alternation between kindness and cruelty that keeps you perpetually hoping for the return of the good version while remaining uncertain when the bad version will emerge. This technique is borrowed from the psychological principles that make gambling addictive, and it is devastatingly effective at maintaining your engagement even in a harmful relationship. The counter to intermittent reinforcement is the recognition that the pattern itself is the problem, not the ratio of good to bad moments. You must train yourself to see the entire cycle as manipulation, rather than seeing the good moments as evidence that the relationship has potential. When the kind phase arrives, you do not let yourself believe that this represents true change, or that you have finally broken through to him. You simply recognize it as the next predictable stage in a cycle that will inevitably return to cruelty. The manipulator maintains power through what might be called the privatization of abuse. He ensures that his worst behavior occurs only when you are alone together, presenting a different face to the outside world. This means that when you try to explain to others what is happening, you sound paranoid or dramatic, because the person you are describing bears little resemblance to the person others know. The reversal here is to begin documenting his behavior and, when appropriate and safe, to ensure that his behavior is witnessed. You do not create confrontations in public, but you do stop protecting him from the natural consequences of his actions being observed by others. If he is cruel to you in front of friends, you do not laugh it off or make excuses for him. If he behaves inappropriately at a family gathering, you do not cover for him. If he says something outrageous, you let it hang in the air rather than rushing to reinterpret it charitably. There comes a point in this theater of reversal when the manipulator realizes that the usual scripts are no longer working, that his customary techniques are meeting unexpected resistance, that the person he thought he knew and controlled has become someone different and dangerous to his agenda. His response to this realization will be escalation, but it will be an escalation tinged with desperation. He will pull out techniques he has held in reserve. He will manufacture crises of unprecedented intensity. He will make promises of transformation that sound more convincing than any he has made before. He will perhaps even seek therapy or other forms of help, not because he genuinely wants to change, but because he has calculated that this is what you need to see to maintain hope in the relationship. The final reversal, and the one that completes your advantage, is the reversal of the relationship's very purpose. The manipulator has established the relationship as existing primarily to serve his needs, with your needs acknowledged only insofar as necessary to maintain your participation. You must internally redefine the relationship's purpose as being entirely about your preparation for departure. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to gather information, to test your defenses, to practice your new techniques, to strengthen your resolve. The relationship is no longer about love or partnership, or even survival. It is about your education in the arts of psychological warfare and your strategic preparation for liberation. When you have made this shift internally, when you are no longer invested in the relationship's continuation, but are simply using the time remaining to ensure the success of your eventual exit, you have achieved the ultimate reversal. You are no longer the victim in his play, but the author of your own story, and that story ends with your freedom. Chapter 5. Life Beyond Manipulation. You have walked through the 3 necessary stages of your education. You have learned to see the manipulator with clarity, stripping away the theatrical fog he generates to obscure his true nature. You have built fortifications in your mind and in your life, establishing defenses that render his weapons less effective with each deployment. You have learned to use his own techniques against him, reversing the flow of power and preparing the ground for your departure. Now comes the final chapter, which concerns itself not with tactics or strategy, but with something more fundamental: the actual execution of your escape and the reconstruction of yourself in the territory beyond his reach. Understand first that there is no perfect moment for departure. The manipulator has engineered your life in such a way that leaving always appears impossibly complicated, fraught with risks that feel greater than the pain of staying. There will always be a reason to wait. The timing is never quite right. The financial situation is not yet stable enough. The children are at a sensitive age. The holidays are approaching, and it would be cruel to disrupt them. A work deadline looms. A family event is scheduled. He has just started therapy and seems genuinely committed to change this time. These reasons are not invalid considerations, but you must recognize them for what they often are: the manipulator's final defense, the moat he has dug around your prison that makes the prison walls appear less significant than the difficulty of crossing the water to reach freedom. The truth that must guide you is this: if you are waiting for a moment when leaving feels easy, or when all obstacles have been removed, you are waiting for a moment that will never arrive. The manipulator has ensured this through years of careful engineering. Your departure will be difficult regardless of when it occurs, and the only question is whether that difficulty is worth enduring for the sake of your liberation. The answer, if you have genuinely absorbed the lessons of the previous chapters, can only be yes. The difficulty of leaving is a storm you pass through. The difficulty of staying is a climate you must endure indefinitely. Choose the storm. When you execute your departure, you must do so with the understanding that the manipulator will deploy every technique he possesses to prevent it or to draw you back. He will cycle through emotions with theatrical speed, moving from rage to despair, to promises of transformation, to threats of self-harm, to renewed rage, all calculated to find the lever that still moves you. He will recruit allies to his cause, sending friends or family members to plead his case, to tell you that you are making a mistake, to suggest that you are being hasty or cruel or selfish. He will manufacture crises that seem to require your intervention, emergencies that only you can solve, situations that appear to prove that he genuinely needs you, and that abandoning him now would make you responsible for whatever catastrophe follows. You must steel yourself against all of these tactics by remembering a principle that the manipulator has worked tirelessly to make you forget. You are not responsible for his emotional regulation, his life choices, his well-being, or his future. These are his responsibilities, and his repeated failures to manage them do not transfer ownership of them to you. When he threatens self-harm, you contact appropriate authorities or support systems rather than rushing back to save him. When he manufactures crisis, you allow the crisis to belong to him rather than absorbing it as your own. When he sends intermediaries, you maintain your boundary with them as well, making clear that your decision is final and that their advocacy for him will not be entertained. This is not cruelty. This is the basic assertion of your right to leave a relationship that harms you, a right that requires no justification beyond your choice to exercise it. The immediate aftermath of departure is often the most dangerous period, not because the manipulator becomes more sophisticated in his tactics, but because he becomes more desperate and therefore more willing to escalate to behaviors he previously kept in reserve. This is when harassment may intensify, when boundary violations may become more flagrant, when the manipulator may attempt to damage your reputation, your relationships, your professional standing, or your sense of safety. You must have prepared for this possibility during the fortification phase, which means you should have documented his behavior, preserved evidence of his manipulation, informed trusted people about the reality of the relationship, and perhaps consulted with legal counsel about protective measures available to you. During this period, you must maintain absolute firmness in your boundaries. The manipulator is testing whether his escalation will achieve what his previous tactics could not, which is your return, or at minimum, your continued engagement with him. Every time you respond to his provocations, every time you attempt to explain your decision or defend your choice, every time you allow yourself to be drawn into conversation or argument, you are teaching him that escalation works and that persistence will eventually breach your defenses. The only effective response to his escalation is the complete absence of response. You become a wall that does not acknowledge the storm raging against it. You are simply impermeable, and his tactics break against your silence like waves against stone. This silence must extend to mutual acquaintances who attempt to serve as intermediaries or who convey messages from him. You must make clear to these people that you are not interested in hearing about him, that you do not want updates on his well-being or reports of his suffering, that you will not receive messages he asks them to pass along. Some of these people will respect your boundary. Others will believe they are helping by keeping communication channels open or by pleading his case. You must be prepared to distance yourself from even well-meaning people who cannot respect your need for complete separation from the manipulator. Your social circle may contract significantly in the aftermath of departure, as people choose sides or simply find the situation too uncomfortable to navigate. This contraction is painful but necessary, and you must remember that relationships that cannot survive your liberation from abuse were not relationships that served your well-being. As weeks become months and the manipulator's tactics fail to achieve their desired result, you will likely observe a shift in his approach. The desperate intensity may give way to calculated coldness, or he may appear to move on suddenly and completely, perhaps entering a new relationship with suspicious speed. Both of these responses serve strategic purposes. The coldness is meant to trigger your fear that you have damaged him irreparably, playing on any guilt or doubt you still carry. The sudden new relationship is meant to make you jealous, or to make you question your decision by suggesting that he has found with someone else the happiness he could not find with you. Neither response is genuine. Both are simply new tactics deployed when the old ones proved ineffective. You must remain unmoved by these performances. If he appears broken by your departure, that brokenness is his to manage, not yours to repair. If he appears to have moved on and found happiness, that apparent happiness is likely another manipulation. And even if it were genuine, it would not mean that you made a mistake in leaving. The manipulator's capacity to be different with someone else, if such capacity exists, does not obligate you to have remained in a relationship where he consistently chose to harm you. You did not leave because he was incapable of change in some absolute sense. You left because the consistent pattern of his treatment of you was unacceptable, and that judgment remains valid regardless of how he behaves with others. The deeper work of this final chapter concerns not the manipulator, but yourself, specifically the project of discovering who you are when you are no longer defined by your relationship to him. The manipulator has occupied so much space in your psychology that his absence creates a void that can feel terrifying in its emptiness. You have spent years, perhaps, with your attention focused on him, on managing him, on predicting him, on defending against him, on trying to fix or change or survive him. When he is gone, the sudden availability of all that attention and energy can be disorienting. You may find yourself thinking about him constantly, even though he is no longer present, replaying conversations, imagining confrontations, crafting arguments you will never deliver, wondering what he is doing or thinking or feeling. This obsessive mental occupation must be recognized as the final vestige of his manipulation, the last way in which he continues to control you even in absence. He has trained you to make him the center of your mental world, and that training does not disappear simply because he is no longer physically present. You must engage in the deliberate practice of redirecting your attention away from him and toward yourself. When you catch yourself thinking about him, you consciously shift your thoughts to questions about your own preferences, needs, desires, and goals. What do you actually enjoy doing when you are not accommodating his preferences? What relationships do you want to cultivate when you are not managing his jealousy or insecurity? What dreams did you defer because they conflicted with his agenda? What parts of yourself did you suppress because they triggered his anger or threatened his control? These questions may be surprisingly difficult to answer, because the manipulator has spent considerable effort convincing you that your authentic self is flawed, excessive, or fundamentally unacceptable. You may discover that you no longer know what you like or want, that your sense of self has become so eroded that you are essentially starting from a baseline of uncertainty about even basic preferences. This uncertainty is not permanent damage, but rather a kind of atrophy that resulted from prolonged disuse of your autonomous judgment. The self you are seeking to reconnect with still exists, but it has been buried under years of adaptation to the manipulator's demands and expectations. Excavating that buried self requires patience and deliberate experimentation. The reconstruction of your life must also address the practical dimensions that the manipulator may have damaged. If he controlled finances, you must rebuild financial independence and literacy. If he isolated you professionally, you must reconstruct professional networks and opportunities. If he damaged your relationships with family or friends, you must undertake the difficult work of repair, acknowledging where his influence caused you to harm those relationships while also establishing new terms for how those relationships will function going forward. If he undermined your physical health through stress or through direct interference with your self-care, you must prioritize the restoration of your body's well-being. These practical projects are not separate from the psychological work of recovery. They are intimately connected because each domain of your life that you reclaim from his influence is territory in which you can practice and experience your own autonomy. You must also grapple with a question that many people find difficult after escaping manipulation. How did this happen to you? This question often carries an implicit self-accusation, a suggestion that you were weak or foolish or damaged in some way that made you vulnerable. This framing is incorrect and harmful. Manipulation succeeds not because victims are weak, but because manipulators are skilled, patient, and willing to exploit fundamental human needs for connection, trust, and love. The manipulator did not succeed in controlling you because you are uniquely flawed. He succeeded because he deployed sophisticated psychological techniques against someone who approached the relationship with good faith and openness, qualities that are virtues in healthy relationships, but vulnerabilities in the presence of someone who views others instrumentally. Understanding how you became vulnerable to manipulation is valuable, but this understanding must be pursued with self-compassion rather than self-blame. Perhaps you had a history that made you particularly susceptible to certain manipulation tactics. Perhaps you had unmet needs that the manipulator initially appeared to fulfill. Perhaps you had been taught that love requires endless sacrifice, or that leaving a relationship represents failure. These vulnerabilities are not character flaws, but rather the inevitable result of being a human with a history, with needs, with the desire for connection. The lesson is not that you should feel ashamed of these vulnerabilities, but that you should recognize them so that you can protect them in the future. There is a particular kind of victory that the manipulator seeks even after the relationship has ended, which is to remain psychologically central to your life through your hatred or anger or fear of him. If he cannot be the beloved, he will settle for being the villain who occupies your thoughts and shapes your choices through your determination to never again experience what you experienced with him. This kind of continued occupation is not freedom. even though it feels very different from the original relationship. True liberation requires not the transformation of love into hatred, but the transformation of intense emotion into indifference. The manipulator becomes someone who once played a significant role in your life, but who no longer has any power over your present or your future. You remember what happened without being consumed by it. You understand what you learned without being defined by it. You recognize the damage without allowing that damage to determine the boundaries of what you can become,